Well, it looks like it's about 5 after, so I'll start the webinar now. My name is Greg Walker. I'm the research director at CABBA, and this is a webinar on smart home as a service. It's going to be led by Alex Glacier from Harbor Research, and we're doing a research project this year on smart home as a service as one of our landmark research projects that's brought forward by our Connected Home Council. And of the RFP submissions, we had several, and at the end of the day, Harbor Research was selected by CABBA, and then again by the initial funders of the research to conduct this the research project. And we've worked with Harbor Research in the past on a couple different research projects, and this is an informational webinar on the topic of smart home as a service in general. And then and at the very end of the webinar, we'll talk about a little bit more about the research projects that we're going to be embarking on if you're interested in taking part. We are recording this webinar, and we'll be sharing it with all those that who registered, and we had over 250 that registered for this particular webinar. And we'll also be sharing the executive summary of a recently completed research project from the Connected Home Council on Connected Home Roadmap. Before we begin, I'll just give a brief overview of CABBA for those that aren't aware. CABBA is an international not-for-profit association that focuses exclusively on intelligent buildings and connected homes. And our vision is to advance the connected home and intelligent building sectors. And we have we do various different initiatives, the traditional to not-for-profit associations like networking and whatnot. But we also have council meetings where we have a connected home council of around 180 individuals in the connected home space, and then we have our Intelligent Buildings Council that meets on a regular basis. And then they have around just over 200 individuals on that particular council. These they meet quarterly and discuss topics, and then they pick research projects. And we also we have a white paper program. We have where we produce white papers out for free to the industry. We have a newsletter that goes out every Thursday to 17,000 subscribers, and various other initiatives that we do here at CABBA. Our board of directors is listed here. These are the companies and organizations that guide and direct what we do as an association. We have a lot more members than this. We have around 390 members or companies, and these are the ones that are really on the board. And we capped this at 25 organizations, and there actually is, their spot just became available. So if there's anyone who's on the call or any organization on the call that's interested in learning more about getting engaged on the CABBA board, feel free to reach out to myself or anyone at CABBA. It's walker@cabba.org, or you can just email cabba@cabba.org. And we can give you a little bit more information about what's involved, and if you're interested in this board of directors seat. I'll give just before we start, I'll give just a thank you to those. These are the funders that are on the current research project, a Smart Home as a Service that Harbor is going to be embarking on, and later on this year. And I just like to thank these funders. And there is opportunity to join the research and get involved on the steering committee level and shape the research if you're interested. These are collaborative research projects where we pool of funds from all the organizations, and we give it to a research firm, Harbor in this case, to make it a little bit more cost effective for research. But without further ado, I'll pass it off to Alex from Harbor to go over the rest of the webinar, and to give us an overview of the landscape and the way they see it as smart home as a service and the opportunities that exist. Alex?
Great. Thanks, Greg. And before I get started, thanks to you and Ron and the whole CABBA organization. We would echo your thoughts. I think it's one of the better industry trade associations in the market, and you guys continue to push the envelope on the quality of research that you're putting out, but also just the activities that you do as an organization. So thanks for the introduction. And just to quickly start, what I'd like to do is provide just a brief background on Harbor Research. Then we're going to jump into the kind of structure of the research and the process by which we're going to address smart home as a service. And then I'll provide some sort of current market insights and some things that we see that are going to help inform the research. So Harbor was founded in 1984. We work with a range of companies. So we work with innovators and startups, people like Sky Foundry, Glassbeam, and others in the building space. We work with larger IT and networks providers, so Intel, Cisco, Microsoft, and so on. And then we work with a third leg of the stool, which is the product OEM, so product manufacturers and utility companies. So we'll work with people like Johnson Controls or Siemens or Honeywell, who are actually manufacturing the products that are being sold into buildings and homes. We've also done quite a bit of work with home software and service providers who might be providing development kits for home hubs and that sort of thing. Functionally, the firm really has three areas of expertise. So we do emerging technology research, like what we're doing here. So looking at the future of smart home as a service and trying to understand what are the business models and revenue models and opportunities that will inform this opportunity. But then also trying to think about customer requirements. So as part of this, we'll be doing a survey of over 1,000 people to really understand what we think the future of in-home user needs are and that sort of thing. The second capability is around strategy consulting. So we work directly with the companies I was talking to before about trying to help them develop new growth strategies for their own businesses. And so it's much more around growth opportunity identification, business model development, and sometimes customer development and co-creation and that sort of thing. And then the third is our smart systems lab, where we actually help design, prototype, and test new models like the one we're talking about here today for delivering value and differentiation in the market. So that's a little bit about us. If you want to go to the next slide. Just to start off, I think it's really important that we talk about kind of this general market. And what I mean by that is sort of what are smart systems? And you'll hear, the term IoT thrown out a lot. And we've kind of moved beyond that. If you look back at M2M, you look at IoT, we really think this is about smart systems and smart services. And smart home as a service is a reflection of that, because once I have physical sensors digitizing that physical space, I have connectivity that's enabling that digitization. That's great, but it's about the data and how are we using data to drive new services, create new processes, and create new value for citizens and consumers, across the entire landscape. And so that's why we really think this is about smart systems and smart services, not just connecting things in the home. If you go to the next slide. We really see sort of many challenges and hurdles that exist in the market. And again, in order to think about smart home as a service, you really have to stop and say, what are sort of those core fundamental challenges or hurdles we have to address? So on the technology side, it's data ownership and privacy and security. It's managing complex data from traditional home systems like HVAC and lighting versus new systems like audio and visual and home hubs. And then it's planning for the future. So thinking about sort of this flexible information architecture that, kind of lets us extend our information and knowledge into these systems in ways that we haven't seen before. On the business side, it's about aligning to provide support services and recruiting the right talent and finding your right place in the ecosystem and making sure that you understand kind of what are those future business models. And then on the customer side, this is probably the most challenging because depending on if I'm looking at demographics, I'm looking at regions within North America, the fragmented customer requirements that are there. Whether that's weather, age, you name it, income, there's a lot of different impacts on those customer requirements. And then lastly, the poor user experience. So too often it's way too hard to interact with these systems. People have been saying ADP's had a smart home as a service for the last 20 years, but ADT, sorry, but nobody's using it because it's hard to use and it's complicated and I've got to use multiple apps and so on. So how do we make this seamless with our daily lives and allow for us to really experience the information in a way that it makes it feel like you're just at home and you're not having to pull something different and new up. Go to the next slide. So when we think about smart home as a service, there are sort of three main buckets of use cases that you have to address. So one is comfort and convenience. And again, this is things like streaming audio and video content, lighting automation and wireless control, garage access, appliances, and so on. The second is safety and security. So home surveillance, smoke and carbon monoxide detection, wellness monitoring for maybe elderly or other types of occupants, water and air distribution, and so on. And then the third is where the money is at. So, resource management. So lighting control and energy monitoring, energy pricing, smart energy management, EV charging is becoming a big thing. And what's that look like as it intersects with home and smart home as a service? And then device and appliance energy usage monitoring. So again, if we think about, smart plugs and being able to turn on and off devices via remote control, there's a lot of use cases around resources that kind of are underlined by all of this home automation hubs and home automation platforms from companies like Control4, et cetera. So if you want to jump to the next slide. We also think that there are several trends that are kind of impacting smart home as a service opportunities. And when we look at these trends, what we're really talking about are four buckets. So there's competitive trends. So amongst the players who are kind of vying for this position. So whether that's Alarm.com, Control4, that could eventually be Apple, that could be Google, Amazon, you name it. There's a lot of companies kind of vying for position. There's the technology that we've kind of touched on a little bit, but we'll go into a little bit more. There's consumer, and then there's socioeconomic. I'll just highlight one or two from each of these to kind of give you a flavor of what we're talking about. So on the competitive side, we use this term strange bedfellows. We think this is about driving new partnerships, new device interactions, and opening new strategic channels. So how these systems actually get deployed, and really trying to form innovative monetization tactics with these kind of peers or potential competitors in ways that we haven't seen before. We think that from a security and energy management standpoint, how can you actually extend your reach into the home and create kind of new relationships, smart home hubs, and so on. The next is technological. So a lot of people have talked about voice as sort of the new UX or UI. And we think that voice recognition coupled with artificial intelligence is a very emerging piece. But the problem is this kind of pervasive sensing and technology is going to be pushed up against things like privacy and security. So we really have to really think through that whole technology architecture and kind of tiptoe our way in, not just dive fully into it, but really prove out the value of the use cases moving forward. From a consumer side, we think that, the emergence of smart phones and wearables, but then the coming kind of emergence of virtual reality and augmented reality is driving demand for these different major mobile platforms. And so eventually, how will the home be controlled and what does that sort of kind of interaction or UI look like? It's very well known that kind of millennials are driving adoption of smart products, but they aren't homeowners yet. So how do we actually use some of their behaviors and work with the traditional homeowners to really kind of enable that adoption of this technology? Because as you know, we can have the greatest service in the world, but if nobody's adopting it, then we're going to continue to kind of stumble like we have in the past. Last piece is socioeconomic. We've touched on it, but cybersecurity and aging population. So if you want to jump to the next slide. For us, we know that smart home has been around for 20 years. We know smart home as a service has been around for 20 years. We know that people have looked at this. For us, this isn't about the current state of the market, and the research isn't really going to look at the current state of the market. The current state of the market is just there to set context. What we're trying to do is look into the future. And what for us, this is much more about moving from simple to compound to complex applications. And what we mean by that is that in a simple application, I can monitor one device or a set of devices. So all of my Sonos music system. What we want to start to see is how all of these devices, kind of, seamlessly integrate. And again, there's companies who say, well, we can do that. Yeah, you can, but how come the consumer's not using your tools today? Because of the fact that it's too complex to manage and onboard all of those devices. So every time I want to use a new device, I've got to onboard it. I got to make sure that the settings are correct. Is there a way that we can actually create compound applications with seamless onboarding, interaction, and usage and troubleshooting and so on? And so for us, we're still early in the game. We think there's a huge opportunity here, and it's untapped mostly. So as we move forward, part of this research is to really understand what are those compound applications and how can we actually drive new value. Next slide. This is just one example of a compound app, but this is like a whole home peace of mind app. So basically anything that's in the home that's connected that will lead to a peace of mind for that consumer or resident would be connected and integrated in this service. So for example, if I think about energy, data, and cost. So I want to make sure that I'm not spending too much money operating my home. But I also want to make sure that just because I'm doing that, when it's 95 degrees outside, I'm not turning on the HVAC. So being able to actually use that balance between, hey, I want to save costs, but I also want to make sure that I'm comfort. But then I also want to make sure I'm secure. So having the right devices, streaming the right data, making sure that I'm able to actually kind of monitor the physical space to ensure that it's safe and secure, but I'm not spending too much money in doing that. And again, one example, but I think part of the research is to really go try and explore what are these examples that consumers care about, because at the end of the day, this is all about what consumers and companies in the industry are developing to create as value for smart home as a service. So next slide. When we think about smart home as a service, we, as Greg mentioned, we've done a few studies on this topic. This just pulls out some insights from one study. We interviewed 500 different consumers about sort of what are the features and functions or characteristics that they care most about, as to why they select certain types of products or things like that. So the top four are probably not surprising, but are a good reminder of the fact that we always have to keep our customers' needs first. So cost savings is one. Reliability is two. And when we say reliability, it's got to work. It's got to be easy to set up. And when it does break, I've got to be able to talk to somebody. I've got to be able to fix it in a way that's efficient. It's got to be reliable across the board. Improve comfort or convenience. So I have to really, every time I interact with that device, feel that I'm getting better, more comfort, or it's convenient to use, etc. And then the last is ease of use. And I would just reiterate, this isn't just about the use in the time. It's about the setup. It's about the troubleshooting. It's all of that. So again, we think that these four kind of characteristics will help us inform what we think a smart home as a service must address moving forward. I'll just call out on the right, it's just to reiterate this installation thing. Installing these tools themselves doesn't create any value. You have to get end users to actually use them. And so for us, it's not just installation, but it's also that usage. And one of the things that we're seeing is that usage monitoring is a way to really kind of better understand, our devices being used. And that comes back to, is it reliable? Does it drive cost savings, et cetera? So next slide. These are some examples of case studies or use cases that we've pulled together to just sort of highlight from our perspective, where are kind of use cases that a smart home as a service has to address. In the upper right, things that jump off the page are things like person-specific routines. So, if it's really going to be as a service, from the time I wake up to the time I go to bed, that routine changes throughout the course of a week, I've got to actually make sure that the people who are actually using the service feel like it's tailored to them. A second one is around data management and data storage. So we think that in the future, homes will almost act like not mini cities, but mini community within itself. So, from the time the car pulls into the driveway and is using electric charging, whether that's wireless or through a traditional EV charging station, to, ordering packages and delivery, to food and water resource and energy. There's a lot of different movement of data in and out of the home. So how that data is managed efficiently with all of the suppliers to create these new value-added services, we think is really important. Other things that kind of have come up that people I think are probably aware of are things like robotic cleaning, temperature automation and control, lighting and automation, HVAC, real-time energy pricing. All of these devices, and use cases, I should say, are really there to help drive interoperability and create kind of more interactions and value-added services through compounding them together. So, for example, if I know that on Tuesdays I wake up at 5 a.m., then certain temperature control, lighting control, robotic cleaning might be reflected, kind of to start different times than if on Thursday I wake up at 7 a.m. So again, just examples, but we do think when we think about smart home as a service, there's got to be sort of a step further that we take this round in developing these services that really look at the data and then kind of bring in all of these devices rather than just a handful of them and use cases. So next slide. So for us, we look at this when we think about smart home as a service is there's three vectors that we have to think about. So the first is partnerships. So you cannot do this alone, obviously, because there's so many devices and so many installed players in the market. So whether that's on the OEM side and I make HVAC equipment or lighting and so on, or it's on the software and services side where I'm alarm.com and I'm actually providing a platform to manage my smart home. There's just a lot going on in the ecosystem. And so we have to actually think about how those ecosystems are going to form to create this new service. The second is obviously the emerging kind of assistants and home hubs and platforms. They definitely play a role in this. And so what will smart home as a service look like as those are integrated? The second is technology implications. So, again, I think a lot of platforms today do a really good job of trapping you and siloing your data. And, we joke in the office all the time, like, are you going to be a Google home? Are you going to be an Amazon home? Are you going to be a Apple home? But truthfully, that's never going to happen. Realistically, you're always going to have interoperability. Different devices are going to need to work with each other. You're going to have to create new value, and it's going to have to be truly kind of interoperable. So as I bring devices online, I've got to be able to actually leverage the data from these devices in an efficient and effective manner. When I think about data exchange and monetization, so within smart cities, we're starting to see emerging groups of players kind of rise up. And what they're doing is they're taking data from all these different anonymous sources, and they're using that data to package it up and create new applications or new opportunities for monetization. So whether that's around advertising and usage, or that's around route optimization, you name it, take that same concept of, I have all of these different homes, I have all of these different consumers. Is there a way that I can anonymize data about usage from these devices and monetize that in ways that I haven't to create new revenue streams while still keeping in mind privacy, security, etc. The third is consumer impacts and adoption. We've done some research that says no interface is the best interface. So, we've really got to remove occupant interactions. We've got to move more towards device and system operational decisions and kind of put those in the background of the users' lives to really make this seamless and frictionless. And so in order for us to get there, we've got to figure out how to do that and drive through to those kind of core action items that give us that value and let the providers act quickly rather than trying to create multiple different venues or avenues that create confusion on the consumer's part. The second piece under consumer would be around, data privacy and trust of especially with listening devices and a lack of standards for data security. Consumers today are skeptical, and to really adopt smart home as a service, we're going to have to overcome these hurdles. Next slide. That being said, we just wanted to bring up a few devices we think are starting to drive adoption. So for example, with Nest, there was a stat that, ROI driven energy savings is like $135 a year or $1,200 in savings over 10 years. So the numbers are starting to prove out that these types of remote control HVAC systems and thermostats are creating revenue and value. Things like surveillance cameras are definitely becoming much more adopted. And so, and the same with remote door locks. So if you know these devices are driving adoption in the home today, for example, LockState, Remote Lock, they just signed a deal recently with Airbnb, where, Airbnb is offering a service to their customers saying, hey, if you put this lock in, we'll help you manage it, etc. And again, just one example, but all of these devices are starting to drive adoption. And so if they are, a smart home as a service obviously has to address these, but then also think about how can we create more value than just the devices themselves. Next slide. This is just to show that there are a lot of devices in the ecosystem. So when we think about, vacuum cleaners or thermostats or wall switches, that's on one side, but then on the other side, we have things like fire and life safety and appliances and door locks. And so all of these devices are coming online and being connected. So it leaves definitely a huge opportunity for data integration, data services, and what people call smart home as a service, because of the fact that these devices are being adopted. Now, where the challenge becomes is what does that interoperability look like? What are the kind of different diverse entrants that could provide these services? How do we work with innovators and established companies in this ecosystem? But again, there's no debate in saying that interoperability and device ecosystems are going to be paramount for driving the smart home as a service. Next slide. Second sort of ecosystem view that I put in here is really just to say that you don't know what you don't know. So, most people would say, well, why would I partner with BMW for smart home as a service? Well, companies like BMW are actually looking at mobility futures and saying, well, you know what? The people who live in homes may not even own cars in the future. They may just have autonomous vehicles picking them up. Well, what scheduling app do I need to integrate with in their personal lives that are actually going to know when to pick them up and where? That's just a very specific example, but it goes to show that this kind of concept of strange bedfellows. So as these different devices and these different ecosystems come together, those companies looking to drive smart home as a service have to look beyond just devices and think about home care services or mobility services or entertainment services. So people like Netflix and Hulu, et cetera. There's going to be sort of an end-to-end value chain here where in order to really drive, to be that interface to that consumer, I've got to have relationships with every touch point that consumer has. And today we think that people are kind of too device-centric and need to look beyond that and really think about all of the applications and use cases and identify business models that are symbiotic in nature. So what I mean by that is whether it's revenue share, licensing fees, however you look at it, people have to be incentivized to want to join your smart home as a service. So it's got to be kind of a give to get relationship in a way that, maybe in the early years, you're not as profitable as you would hope to be because you're kind of developing those relationships and creating that value. Next slide. This is to say that basically the quickest way to kind of show this is to say that, there are many traditional providers, but over time what we're seeing is that these providers are moving across the value chain, whether that's through partnerships and acquisitions or it's just thinking about new products and services. You're starting to see these companies kind of branch out and act as the interface. Now that creates a bit of a challenge because if I have 6 smart home as a services, do I really have one? And so we think that this research is really going to have to take that next step in defining the business models, managing those kind of installed base of ecosystems and services so that you can kind of become the systems of systems dashboard and rise above the noise that exists in the market today. Next slide. So now what I'm going to do is spend a few minutes sort of talking through the research that we're proposing. And again, the one thing I would say is, we tend to be very flexible with the steering committee. So as I go through this, if you're listening and thinking about joining, know that there is flexibility to get your dog in the fight, to be able to actually kind of find inputs that you're looking for. But this is sort of the general framework that we've put together to really kind of help scope the work that we're planning on doing. So on the left, we definitely want to look at the evolution of the market, devices, technologies, applications. I mentioned data monetization, data exchange. What does that look like in the context of the home? What implications or what are the core applications that are being adopted today? And really getting that feedback from consumers. What are the requirements for interoperability? So are there, certain systems that tend to go together more? So home hubs with speakers, for example, or televisions with audio, or lighting systems and appliances, etc. So we think that there is a huge opportunity to look there. What are some of the barriers? So obviously, smart home has been around a long time. We're seeing some uptick in certain areas and others we're not. How do we actually make that next step to really actually drive forward? How are connected home opportunities evolving their business and revenue models to meet changing customer demands for payment or revenue realization? The other piece I would just bring up is again, it's all about data, it's all about monetization, but we have to be able to drive that tangible revenue. So what does the ROI look like? What's the business case, and so on? The last is just sort of what are the implications for applications and use cases that are being built for homes, and how can OEMs, suppliers, services, companies, utilities actually monetize depending on where you sit in the value chain. The next, I think, is probably the most important, but you kind of got to set the context before you get there, is the evolution of the consumer. So, when we think about smart home as a service in 5 years, who is that consumer? What are they going to want? What are they going to need? Especially when you think about different demographics and income, gender, region, how does that vary? What is the differences in usage behavior and attitudes on home applications among these demographics? What are the preferred user payments for these different demographics? And, that interaction, we said, no interface is the best interface. Well, what does that look like for different home service providers and home users? And then what are the relevant considerations that consumers are taking into account when buying and subscribing to services? So why do you subscribe to, Netflix over Hulu, or Disney is coming out with their own? What did Disney do to decide, in their smart home service that they're going to kind of take a higher road, etc. So with all of these different media services, with all of these different tools and different information bases, how does that inform how smart home as a service evolves? Because obviously they've got a pulse on the consumer and what they're watching and their behavior. Can we maybe think about how that integrates with some of the behaviors within purchasing around home devices and hubs and etc.? The third step is a set of questions around looking at really the strategic alternatives. So this to us is the most important for the stakeholders, which is, what ecosystems relationships do I need to think about if I'm a device manufacturer, or if I'm a platform provider, or if I'm a utility, or I'm a third-party integrator? All of those considerations matter. What does the impact have on these solutions? How do these solutions or product installations influence the purchasing and buying behavior? So for example, in one of the studies we've looked at in the past, it's new home builders that are speccing in a lot of these sensors and devices. How are we working with them to create kind of home services that differentiate their homes that they're building? Who are the key innovators gaining traction? How are they driving, differentiating themselves, et cetera? And then, how should companies think about pricing and monetizing their solutions? What customer behaviors around privacy and security matter? What are the delivery solutions that should be taken into account, and how to best structure pricing and revenue models? So again, these are the high level scope questions. What we do is we kind of go through these with each stakeholder and make sure that they're bought in. We edit them to make sure we're covering everybody's needs. But this is kind of the going in assumption of scope questions we're going to try and address. When I think about research design for smart home as a service, one of the things that we do is we kind of start out with really thinking through that survey. So we're going to look to survey about 1,000 to 1,500 markets participants. So this will include homeowners and tenants of homes, but then also potentially operators and home developers, as I mentioned earlier. And then others respondents that the committee feels makes sense. But we'll start with that survey and really get the feedback so we can kind of pull the data. Then what we'll do is we'll actually conduct 10 to 15 interviews to understand, kind of these user needs, technical requirements with some of the more kind of participants in the market. So these are product OEMs, these are systems integrators, these are technology suppliers, platform and application providers, home hub providers, and so on. From there, what we'll do is we'll kind of take the interview data and we'll take the survey data and we'll start to pull together a hypothesis for where we think smart home as a service has to go. And we'll use 10 to 15 interviews in a Delphi-like approach where you start kind of bringing clusters together to get feedback from experts in the space to really further validate the results and really make sure that the findings that we got are in line with our hypotheses. Once that's done, we'll actually start to build out the business cases for each participant group. So what we'll do is we'll take each of the kind of steering committee members and we'll glom them into groups. And we'll say, all right, so here are the OEMs and product providers. Here are the service providers. Here are the software and innovators and so on. And we'll say for each one of these groups, what does the business case look like? Utilities and end users or enterprises will have their own. And we'll say for smart home as a service, what's your play? What's your revenue strategy? Who are the devices, ecosystem players you need to think about? What are the services you need to think about? And really dive into those business cases so that coming out of the study, the participants have actionable, recommendable kind of steps they can take based on the research that was conducted. If you want to go to the next slide. This is just to show sort of a quick way that we look at market feedback. So again, for us, this isn't a one size kind of fits all. You really kind of have to bring together different targets for the interviews. On the survey, it'll be mainly focused around consumers, but for the interviews, it'll be a mix of these different types of companies to really drive home sort of that view. And again, we'll also kind of look at things like revenue and trying to understand services models and really hopefully bring some forecasting and to really kind of lay out what that pricing model will look like for smart home as a service in the future. Next slide. And this is my last slide. But again, we focus in on deliverables. We usually tend to meet every week or 2 weeks. It's very collaborative. We don't just go away and show back up. We like to work with our steering committee members to really make sure they're getting what they need out of it. And to be honest with you, we encourage participation. The more participation we get from the steering committee, the better, because then it's a product that they can actually use. So we've done this a couple times, and the ones that are more participative and kind of give their opinions early on are really great because it really helps shape the research. So Greg, I know we've got about 10 minutes left for questions. But again, and if we don't have any questions, I can keep going, but I figured it might be good to stop and see if we've got some questions.
Yeah, so there's a couple ways to do questions. Probably the preferred way would be to raise your hand. There's a little raise your hand button and I'll activate your audio. The other option is there's a Q&A box that Alex can probably check as well. And then there's also a chat box. You can enter your question in there. If you have any questions about the Smart Home as a Service in general or about the research project, both are welcome. And I'd like to thank again the funders of this research. This is a really $150,000 research project as a whole, and the funding levels to get involved are $5,000, $10,000 to be on the steering committee, and then $15,000 to get a case study incorporated into the research. And only the funders would get the full research project. We will be sharing the slide deck with everybody, and we'll also be sharing the recording and an executive summary of a previous research project actually completed by Harbor Research on a connected home roadmap. So with that,
there's a couple questions, Greg, if you want to jump into them.
I'd just like to call on a couple of the steering committee members that are on the project, and they have a few words to say. I think Maybe we'll start with Lori from Ream. There's also David from Residio and Richard from TELUS.
Hey guys, so this is Lori Adams. I'm with Ream. I've known CABBA for a long time. I used to be the marketing director over at the Broadband Forum. So this is exciting to see CABBA getting involved in this type of research. Here at Ream, we've really been excited to be a part of funding this research. Our president, Chris Peel, has been fascinated for more than 10 years by what Ream could accomplish if we brought in sensors and operating systems into our water heaters and HVAC products and refrigerated products. And we developed our EcoNet platform to really be able to give that customer that single interface with all of those products. And it was all really built with the customer in mind. But lately, we've really begun to explore what we could do with the rich kind of interaction and performance and life cycle data that we're getting from having this network of products out in the marketplace. And we really realized here at Ream that we were just scratching the surface on what we could do with this data, and also, you know, really who else in the ecosystem might benefit from the data. And so that's really part of why we stepped up to sponsor this report, because we really think if you're a leader in this area, it's really important to help that whole ecosystem move forward with as much interoperability, which obviously being from the Broadband Forum is important to me, and interconnection. So I'm looking forward to working with many of the companies here. I feel like discovery is the first step to really developing the kind of homes that are going to make families thrive. And when we start looking at sustainability, this is really going to be important. Just really pleased to be a part of this and encourage others to join us in this important study.
Thank you.
No problem.
Maybe David from Residio.
Yeah, hi. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Hi, this is Dave Kaufman. I'm with Residio. Let me give you a little bit of background. So some of you may not know what Residio is. It's actually a company that was spun off from Honeywell last fall. The connected home business within Honeywell, and so thermostat security systems, cameras, leak detectors, all those kinds of things were all spun off into a company called Residio. It's a combo word, stands for residence and Presidio pulled together, called Residio. And we were involved at Honeywell with CABBA. I think we were one of the original charter members of CABBA 30 years ago. Honeywell was. So as we spun off, obviously we wanted to continue our relationship with CABBA, so we've rejoined, and we're on the board now also at CABBA. And obviously this research is very pertinent to our business, right? Smart home really is the Residio business, and smart home as a service is an emerging opportunity that, you know, being one of the leaders in comfort and security and all the things I just mentioned a minute ago, and that obviously Alex echoed in this presentation as a key area for smart home. If that starts to become service oriented, you know, we need to understand that emerging opportunity and really understand the parameters and the enablers of that opportunity. And I think that's really important to understand what are those enablers that would cause or be forcing functions to get this to emerge in the marketplace, or that would cause this to emerge in the marketplace. And then given those enablers, what I'm really interested in is what can we do as an industry group to accelerate that, or to also help that along to bring this to market? Can we go and adjust some standards that are out there, or create a new standard, or go create an alliance that can go help get this to emerge into the marketplace and take advantage of this opportunity? Because a rising tide raises all ships. So if there's something we can do that this emerging opportunity helps all of us, then let's work together to go make that happen. So I'm very interested in what are those enablers, and as we do this research, make sure we capture those so that we as an organization or as an industry can go and help those to come to reality and make these opportunities, a smart home as a service, of reality for all of us to take advantage of.
Thanks a lot. And And finally, Richard, tell us.
Hi, Greg. Thanks very much. And I'll make this really quick. First of all, nice presentation, Alex. Anyway, with respect to the rationale behind the investment, we at TELUS have been investing in deploying fiber across the Canadian service area for several years, and we'll continue to do that, I think, until the dawn of time, or until the end of time. But really why we invested here is really looking for kind of your view on service opportunities within the smart home area. And with respect to the definition of smart home, we're definitely looking at single family homes as well as multifamily, and then what opportunities might exist on the rental property side of things. TELUS is expanding into the business and home security arena, and furthermore is looking to couple, well, how does that fit with respect to some of the things that Alex has said, and very much has hit the point that there is a strong alignment in many of these areas. And then finally, obviously from a business case point of view, is really looking at what opportunities exist specifically for internet service providers. And then just building on the presentation, I think it's going to be an excellent investment, and really looking forward to see how this unfolds. So thank you.
Thank you. And in terms of questions, if you're typing them in, we'll get to as many of them as Alex will get to as many of them as he can, and then if not, we can answer them offline. I think Benno has his hand raised. If you want to speak now, or Alex, you can go through any of the questions that you see in the chat box or the Q&A.
Yeah, sorry, this is Benno from Equity Consulting. Thanks for the great presentation. I think this is a really great opportunities for players in the market to join and to get more insight and also directions for their developing new business models. One of the things I noticed was, from my experience, that there are other players in the market I see and I work with that have a strong interest in home automation and smart home as a service business models, like insurers and water utilities, which basically are service providers to homes. So I would like to see that also included in this project. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely noted. Appreciate you bringing up the point about insurance. I think that's really important. And I think from a utility perspective, we're definitely considering energy and water utilities and their play. So yeah, definitely appreciate that, and we'll make a note. So one of the questions that came in was, what about cybersecurity and privacy by market, consumer, and solution delivery / alternatives? And I think, it's definitely something that we're going to consider, in many facets. So whether it's on the consumer side and it's around, is this an inhibitor of adoption, et cetera, but also, how do companies have to address security in order to drive a smart home as a service? And again, I want to emphasize, this is not going to be about just the state of the market, but much more about looking forward into the future. What is the requirement to actually address that? So whether it's in the specific devices in across the markets and value chains that exist within the smart home, or it's solution delivery, we definitely are going to keep an eye on it, because we know it's a key factor in driving adoption. Another question was around just sort of smart home and smart buildings are kind of two different ecosystems of partners. Will you extend this research into smart buildings, or do another one to address this other business scope? Would completely agree with your statement that smart buildings and smart homes are two different worlds. And for this purpose of this research, we're going to be mainly focused on just smart home. And so we'll be sinking our teeth there, interviewing consumers and so on. So, surveying consumers. So that will be the majority of the focus, unless the steering committee were to say otherwise, but I don't see that happening. So I think, yeah, we'll be focused on smart home here. And I think that is most of the questions that came in, Greg. So with that, I'll pass it back to you.
Sorry, in the Q&A box, I think there's a couple more. I think David Katz has how do you separate the issues from those that rent or in a condo with the minimal control from the homeowners?
Sorry. Okay. I'm just looking at those
Yeah.
now. My apologies.
And if you do have any questions and you want to speak your question, just raise your hand and we'll allow you to speak. And maybe a little bit easier to do it that
Yeah,
way.
so I'll just address David's quickly. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to talk to MDU operators and homeowners. So yes, I think those issues will be different, but I think that the thing we'll have to really come back to is it's about smart home as a service. So whether we're looking at this from a demographic standpoint, so certain age groups is one way to kind of curb that problem. Another way is to think about device type. So in areas you're not going to have certain devices, whereas in others you may. But I think it's definitely something we're aware of, we've dealt with in the past, and we'll definitely try and address kind of that divide, etc. Let me see. So there's another question that is, it's interesting to see how various players from across the value chain are coming to market with smart home solutions, ADC, utilities, Xfinity, et cetera. Do you think national home builders will enter this space like smart home as a service? And it's interesting as a channel to market. If I'm the Reams and Residios of the world, I have to think about home builders because they're sometimes the ones speccing these systems. And so I don't know if they will ever own the interface and the actual relationship with the customer, but I know that they will be an influencer. And so as we look at the research, that's definitely something we're going to try and validate and look at, but we know home builders definitely play a piece in this. Another quick question was, will your research cover mixed use section of high-rise buildings, or is that covered separately? Dan, just to be straightforward, I think in the context of this, we will only be looking at, MDUs as multi-dwelling units as the residential side. If you're referring to commercial less, we're much more focused, or retail for that matter, we're much more focused specifically on homes and consumers. We will send the emails. The slides will be emailed to register attendees. Sorry, I'm just kind of going through these as they're coming in. Will your study address occupants' comfort in tandem with savings? Absolutely. As I mentioned in our past research, we know that comfort and reliability and savings are there. So any smart home as a service definitely has to be able to address those. And so we will definitely look at those different features. Sorry, I'm just clearing out the queue real quick. A lot of great questions coming in. Greg, do you see any ones that I'm missing here from my experience? Here we go. So, residents, consumers like insurance and water utilities. Yeah, Benno mentioned that. Yes, we will definitely look at that.
I think Guy has a question here. He's raised his hand. I just unmuted you. Okay. Well, while he's gathering his thoughts, if there's any more there.
Can you say something about the security and privacy in all three areas, the market, the consumer, and the apps?
Yeah, that's I'd mentioned it earlier, Guy. I'm not sure if you heard me, but what I was saying is that we will definitely be looking at, if I'm going to deliver a smart home as a service, what security technologies do I need to consider? For example, we mentioned privacy with kind of voice-enabled devices. We're going to have to make sure that we're looking at that. What are the newest trends? How is that going to inform these other services? So it's definitely something that we're looking at. And I will tell you, from our past research, that is definitely one of those kind of looming inhibitors to adoption. And so we know that it has to be addressed in this study in order for that to work. And just quickly, to David Goswick's point, he was asking about, how can, House Zero, who's currently got, couple 100,000 realty agents using it, and looks at data sets on 130 million homes. We would love to interview you as part of the research. Maybe potentially highlight your solution as an example of how you're driving new services to smart home, and we will follow up with you after the webinar to make sure that we can be able to address that. Let's see. I think I've got time for probably one more question. So it's from Jesus Arias Garcia. On the slide, device ecosystems and interoperability, only brands are listed, but not a word about the various standards that bring interoperability and seamless integration. Where do these standards fit in the equation? We would definitely look at standards evolution. The challenge with standards is that it's a bit of the wild, wild west. We know that we need to look at it, and it'll probably fall within the technology aspect of this opportunity and analysis and research. But I would say that it's definitely something we'll look at, but it's not going to kind of be, I think there's other core components around revenue models, around integration and services. Obviously, standards is big, but we'll definitely consider it. And if the steering committee says, hey, we want to double down on standards, we will. But I think the way we've originally scoped it is it's a more smaller portion of that. So I know we're at the top of the hour, Greg, so I wanted to hand it back to you. And thank you, everybody, for these great questions and participation. I know we had almost 110 people here today, so really, really good attendance. So thank you for everyone.
Maybe we can do, just before we leave, I think Mark had one question there. I unmuted him. And then I'll just point out to everyone, I'll send everyone an email with the slide deck, the recording, the executive summary of the previous research that we did with Harbor, the Connected Home Roadmap. And if you're interested in getting involved in the research project, definitely feel free to reach out to myself or anyone at CABBA, and we can set up another call separately to go over what's involved. So with that, I think I'll leave the last question up to Mark, and then we'll end the webinar. Well, it looks like you may be unavailable. So with that, I'll end the webinar now, and then if you have any questions about the Smart Home as a Service, about the research project, or anything like that, just respond to the email that we send out to all those that registered, and feel free to share the link and the recording with those that are unable to attend. Thanks a lot for your time, and have a good rest of your day. And thanks a lot, Alex, for the good presentation and your questions.
Absolutely. Thanks to Greg and CABBA for this, and we look forward to get going when the time is right.
Thank you.